We talked a couple of weeks ago. Of course, last Wednesday was our gospel meeting, but 2 weeks ago we were talking about the life of the shepherd and the importance of water. You don't give water a whole lot of thought because we just use it. We turn on a tap and you have water. But they depended on water just like all life depends upon water. But it wasn't so easy to obtain. I don't think I mentioned this. I keep wanting to say Rob. Got Rob Whitaker in my mind because he's doing a personal evangelism seminar coming up. Victor and I went down there Thursday to the Biblical History Center, and the tour guide, which I told Victor I was excited for him because Vern was our guide, and so he got to have the best. But he said something that I had forgotten, and I don't think I mentioned it in our class on water. He was talking about when you have an abundance of something, you have all these different words for it. He was talking about the Eskimos have, I forget how many words he said for snow, because there's so much snow, where Eskimos live. But in Palestine, one thing that there's not just an overabundance of is water. There are some places where there's quite a bit of rainfall, some places not very much, but especially if you're a nomadic living out in the wilderness of Palestine, there's not a whole lot of water. So they basically had two terms that they would use to refer to water. One of them was for gathered water. What is the word for gathered water? In fact, you may have noticed this when Solomon was building the temple. He had this basin, and they had a strange name for it. And I've always, before I had learned this from the Biblical History Center, I always wondered, why on earth did they call it that? But now I know, it's because it's gathered water. What was that vessel called? The sea. It was made of what? Bronze. The bronze sea. Have you ever wondered when you read that and go, why is it called a sea? It's a big container, and it holds a lot of water, but to call it a sea, that was what the Jews would refer to gathered water. And that's why there's a lake in Palestine that's really, it's a large lake, but it's basically a lake. But it's called what? The Sea of Galilee. Not really what we would call a sea, but it's gathered water. So they called it the Sea of Galilee. And so that helps you to understand why sometimes you see these names that maybe to us don't make sense, but gathered water is a sea. And what was moving water called? This one we did talk about. What was the Jews' word for it, or phrase, I guess? Living water. Living water is water that is moving, it comes to you. Came to represent, of course, the grace of God. So, I wanted to mention that because I forgot to mention about sea. One other thing before we move on from that slide got put in from last week. We talked about, I remember why I left this in here. Because jars were often used to draw water. We were talking about wells, and Jimmy talked to us about wells, and I appreciate him doing that because that's kind of his expertise, right? So you would often use some kind of a jar, many times clay, and you draw that water out, but sometimes you needed to travel a little bit farther with it, so you would have something like a skin. Here's an example of a goat skin used to carry water over longer distances. It's not the most pleasant of thought to be drinking out of that, if you ask me, but this is what they would use quite often for carrying water over a long distance. Why do you reckon you might use that as opposed to a clay jar? They break. Clay jars break very easily, right? You could drop one of those things even in the sand, and there goes your water. And buddy, you get out in the desert and you lose your water, you're in trouble. That'll ruin your weekend, as they say. So the skins were flexible. They're not as likely to break as the clay jars. We'll see a few uses of this in Scripture. Let me get a couple of folks to read if I can. I got a typo there. I got Samuel 25:18. Let's try 1 Samuel. I'm thinking that would be David on the run. Yeah, 1 Samuel. Yes, sir.
Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 bottles of wine, and 5 sheep ready dressed, and 5 measures of parched grain, and 100 cluster of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and laid them on the donkeys.
All right, so Abigail is, you remember this is, you've got Nabal. The name means folly, and he was a fool. He was very, very unthankful for David's men looking out for him, and all they want is some help because they're out in this wilderness, and he won't give them anything. And so David is angry, and David is on his way. His men are going to attack. They're going to take care of Nabal. So Abigail, being a peacemaker, she's going to go out to David and see if she can't talk him out of this. And of course, we know the rest of the story. She does. But she's going to come to him with provisions. That was all he really wanted to begin with, right? Was some help for his man, some provisions. So she loads up a bunch of stuff. Well, among that are the King James, and I think that's the American Standard you're reading from. Is that right? Right, yeah. It's the King James and some, I think even the New King James. Anybody got a New King James there? It says bottles. It says skins. Okay, so that's the better translation. Sometimes it can mean bottles, like in the sense of something clay or whatever, but most of the time, almost always it refers to a skin. And it'll say bottle because what'll happen is eventually those skins, they're not very flexible, and they can actually become brittle and break as a bottle would. So that word bottle is the idea of skin. It's some kind of a skin. This in the picture up here is an example of a larger skin, but they, obviously they came in all sizes. And in fact, you can see on this picture right here, it had sprung a leak, and they've had to patch it or tie it off. There's different ways of fixing a leak. So these skins. Another example being Job 32. Yes, sir.
Indeed, my belly is like wine that has no vent. It is burst like new wineskins.
Job there issuing forth a complaint in his misery. It says his belly is like wine. And in that instance, remember we talked before, wine can mean grape juice or it may mean intoxicating wine depending on the context. Here it's obviously talking about grape juice. It's grape juice that hasn't fermented, because what's going to happen as it ferments? What happens? It expands, right? It gives off, there's gas, and it'll actually, it can burst the wineskin. So he says his belly's like that, describing some of his sickness. Job 38:37. The bottles of heaven. So a reference there to rain, as if heaven had these skins filled with water, and when it rains, it's a metaphor for rain. So you see that finding its way into the Hebrew thought and being used in Scripture. Psalm 56, verse 8. I love this verse. It has you kind of get a different appreciation for it when you understand the context of these skins and such. All right. Numbers my wanderings, puts my tears into his bottle, or the psalmist crying to God, put my tears in your bottle. The idea that God sees our tears, he knows, he understands, but again, it's a very familiar illustration there. Bottles, it's actually a different word here than in 1 Samuel, but it's another word. It's one of those that's often translated bottles, but typically it's referring to skin, some kind of an animal skin used for carrying liquid. And then a more familiar reference to us is in Matthew 9:17.
Neither do men put new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break, and the wine runs out, and the bottles perish. But they put new wine into new bottles, and both are preserved.
I had somebody tell me one time, we were somehow or another got into a discussion about alcohol and social drinking of alcohol, and I said there was nothing social about it, and there was nothing in Scripture that would condone that a Christian ought to have nothing to do, shouldn't even touch the stuff. especially knowing what we know about it now and the dangers associated with it and the evils associated with it. But anyways, in the discussion, the person went to Matthew 9:17. He said, look, Jesus said, you don't put new wine into old bottles. He understood it's going to ferment. It's going to become intoxicating wine. And so there you go. And I was just one of those where sometimes you just are flabbergasted. And you want to say, did you even bother to read anything surrounding this verse? So what's Jesus saying here? He's obviously not saying contextually, hook yourself up with some wine and enjoy it. Talk about alcoholic wine. What's he saying? He's saying, it's the idea of he's not coming to be a reformer of Judaism, right? The new wine, the new law is not going into an old skin, Judaism. The old law is going to be done away, fulfilled. And the new wine, the new law, is going into a new skin. So that's what he's saying. It has nothing to do with alcohol. It's an illustration. He has nothing to do here one way or the other with drinking alcohol or not drinking alcohol. He's saying, I didn't come to reform Judaism. I didn't come to set Judaism right. He says, I came to fulfill the law in its entirety, take it out of the way, nail it to the cross, and there's going to be a new law, new leader, new law, and of course, a lot of that gets back to Hebrews we talked about Sunday night. It's going to be better than the old law. So I wanted to mention that before we moved on from talking about just water in general. It's amazing to me, studying this, how much I personally, I can't speak for other people, but I personally tend to take water for granted. Again, that we can just turn on a tap and you got water. It wasn't so easy for them. Sometimes they had to draw it, even if there's a spring. How do you get it back home? So one of the ways that you would travel a great distance was with these skins. Let's talk a little bit about the life of a shepherd. When we think about shepherding, we often picture our rolling green hills as opposed to the rugged wilderness of the Middle East. Not always, but I think sometimes if we're not careful, that's what we think about. But the grazing areas in Palestine typically are the low southeastern parts, which receive not really that much rainfall. The shepherd, if he's going to be a very good shepherd, if his sheep are going to last very long, and really him too if he goes out for very long, he's going to have to know where to find water. He's got to know where the wells are. He's got to know where the cisterns are, and they're not that plentiful, but there are a few springs around there, and he needs to know where they are, right? Because the sheep have to have water. So a good shepherd's got to know where to find those things. Sheep also required shepherds because there were a lot of predators around there. The Bible's going to talk about wolves. What else tended to be predators of sheep? Do what? Lions. And what else? Bears. We think about Palestine nowadays, and you don't typically think about lions and bears. And do you remember why we said these animals are pretty much, in fact, the last lion, it's in the book. I made some copies of the pages. The last lion was seen in the Palestinian area, I want to say like 6th century. I haven't seen one since then. Well, yeah, 6th century. So that'd be the 500s. That was the last time anybody saw a lion around Palestine. But why is that? The Romans. It's also the reason there aren't very many trees around there either. There never were just an abundance, just an overabundance of trees, but there are not nearly as many now because many of them were cut down. Sometimes they're used for fires, sometimes for building, sometimes many of them around the Jerusalem area. Why were they cut down? To become crosses in AD 70. There were a lot of people that the Romans crucified when they put down that rebellion once and for all of the Jewish nation. So a lot of trees got taken out because of that, and it's hard to find. Remember we talked about the lessons from the olive press. It's been maybe a year or so back, and olive trees live like almost forever. If if the conditions are right. That's assuming nobody comes along and cuts you down just for spite, right? And that's what sometimes the Romans would do to the Jewish, the olive trees and olive vineyards in the land of Palestine. So, I want to mention this passage here from 1 Samuel 17. David tells Saul, thy servant kept his father's sheep. There came a lion and a bear and took a lamb out of the flock, and I went out after him and smote him and delivered it out of his mouth. When he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, smote him and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. So David's saying this as he's preparing to go against the Philistine Goliath. But he's telling Saul, of course, Saul probably, like most people, thought this was kind of a joke compared to the Philistine. Hardly a comparison in their mind. But David is saying to them, look, I'm not afraid. I've taken on a lion, I've taken on a bear, defending my sheep, and that was just an animal that doesn't have a soul. But these are God's people being reviled by this Philistine. He's defying God, the God of heaven, and God's going to be with me, and I'm going to take him out. So the idea there of a sheep and a lion being predators. So the shepherd's life was a very interesting life. Some of this we're going to kind of interweave as we go along. I struggled to figure out how exactly I want to put all this together, because there's things I want to talk about with the shepherd's tent and stuff like that, but we'll come back to that in a little bit. But a good shepherd knew where to find green pastures. Does that sound familiar? Reminds us of Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Verse 2 begins, he maketh me to lie down in green pastures. If you got a land that's just nothing but rolling hills and green pastures, then that doesn't mean as much. But when you got to know where to find those green pastures, doesn't that mean something to have the shepherd who knows where they are and he takes you there? He leads you to the green pastures. So here are some pictures of shepherds. This top picture leading their sheep through some greener pastures. Here's sheep coming down a hillside with the shepherd. I think he's right there. But not always easy to find those green pastures. Sometimes while they're out in the wilderness, you're out. You don't just always get to go out and come back in the same day. Sometimes you have to go on out. And so sometimes you have to make a temporary shelter. And that's what you see here. These pictures are actually from the Biblical History Center in LaGrange. It was almost, excuse me, it was almost providential, because I was telling somebody, I think I even told the class 2 weeks ago, that I had very few pictures from the Biblical History Center, and I thought, I wish I had thought to take more pictures. The several times that I've been, sometimes you just get caught up and you're listening and you're so just riveted by the fellow telling you about all this that you realize I didn't take any pictures, and that's kind of what's happened to me. And so I had Victor on Thursday. I was going to be the one responsible for providing lunch, and so we were thinking about going to Carrollton or something like that. And I said, hey, there's this place down in LaGrange if you want to go. And so we ended up going, and I was able to get some pictures. But you see here some sheep, not real, of course. But you see this temporary shelter. A lot of times they would go back up against a mountain somewhere, so that way you're not having to build 4 walls or makeshift walls. But you see this down here, this is just a closer picture of the same little temporary sheepfold. And over here is a more permanent one. We'll look at that in just a moment. But you see here, he's just finding what brush, sticks and stuff that he can find, and he puts that to kind of make a wall. And I believe, I thought I had one of a, well, I thought I had a picture. Oh, I think it's in the book. I need to add that to my slides. But you can't see it, but over here, kind of out of the frame here, there's a little makeshift door. And it's basically the same thing. It's more twigs, and you can sort of pick it up and slide it out, and you can pick it up and slide it back, and it'll essentially meet that opening. So that way your sheep can come in and out, but you've got a sort of a makeshift door that lets them in and out, but also is closable. Sheep will, I'm told, relax visibly once they're inside the fold, and secure with their shepherd. They say that you can see that visibly, how the sheep relax. But if you're looking at this, you may be thinking, as I did at first, one of the main predators is what? Lion, wolves. I mean, what about 3 feet? You might be lucky if you get 3 feet out of that. How's that gonna stop a predator? Especially you think about a wolf, a lion, a bear. How's that gonna stop them? You got the shepherd, but also if you're animals, they're obviously not as intelligent as humans, but they ain't stupid. You can get in that if you're a lion, but you know what you're wanting to come out with if you're a lion? A sheep. Now, getting back out with that sheep is a different story, isn't it? That's not going to be so easy. And so he knows, any animal, any predator knows, I got to get in, but I got to get out. And so it's a deterrent. Now, it's not always going to stop them from even trying, but it certainly is a deterrent. And as Jimmy mentioned, you also got Mr. Shepherd, who's not going to just stand there and go, oh, well, if you can get out, you can have him. So, when you look at that, my first thought was, wait a minute. A cat especially, some kind of tiger, a lion, could just jump right over that. Wolves, even bears. But it's coming back out with the prey that's going to be difficult. Isaiah is going to use the idea of peace and the absence of predators to depict the church age. Turn to Isaiah chapter 11. A lot of folks take this erroneous position of premillennialism that Jesus is going to establish some kind of kingdom on earth, and they'll take this passage and apply it to some kind of millennial reign, but it's in its context, it's talking about the church age. There's going to be peace in the body of Christ. What's Isaiah 11:6 say?
The wolf also shall dwell with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, the calf and the young lion, and the fatling together, and the little child shall lead them.
The wolf lying down with the lamb. Peace. Getting along. Obviously, that doesn't happen naturally, but that's a picture of the kingdom of Christ, the peace and absence of conflict, absence of predators. I'm going to move past this for just a second and come back to that in just a moment. Sometimes you need a more permanent sheepfold. It's still not as permanent as the long term. Now, sometimes these could be a more permanent, like in the sense of permanent. Sometimes it'd be, I guess, semi-permanent is what we call them. But obviously much more permanent, even if it's not meant to be the 100% permanent. If it's semi-permanent, it's better than the ones that we just saw. As you can tell, it's using a lot of stone. Even before all the trees got cut down or burned or whatever, there wasn't just an overabundance of them in Palestine, but you know what they do have in abundance in Palestine? Rocks. Mr. Verne tells the story that there's an old Jewish saying that God sent 2 angels with bags of rocks to disperse them over all the earth, and one of the angels got tired, and when he was over Palestine, he just dumped his bag out. And there's just so many rocks there. There's just an overabundance of rocks. So when you got that much of something, guess what you do? You use it. So they use rocks quite a bit. And so here you see the more permanent. Again, you're backing up against a mountain or something like that. In fact, you'll notice this, we'll talk about this in just a moment. Quite often they would back up to a cave. That gave you a little additional something there. There's a middle partition here. I'll talk about that in just a moment. But again, here you see you've got the rock wall and then these sticks on the top. Now this is higher. It's going to be more difficult. Again, there's not an overabundance of wood, so the makeshift temporary shelter, you can't afford to try to build up a wall that's 3 or 4, more than maybe 2.5, 3 feet. But here it's a higher wall, and then you put the sticks on the top, and a lot of times sometimes they would even sharpen sticks and have them sticking up, so that now a predator tries to jump over, and it becomes even, far more difficult to get out with the prey. Sometimes they could even hurt themselves if they They could gash their belly, the soft underside, if they tried to jump over. There's Mr. Vern. You hear me talk about him a lot. He was our tour guide this last time. I took that picture just last Thursday. And he's standing there in the door of the sheepfold. Here he is again talking about this. And I want to mention something. Here you can see some hay over here. Here's a couple of mangers for the animals to eat from. This is the left-hand side as you're facing the sheepfold. And you got a little spot there where the shepherd could have a meal if he wanted to cook or something like that. Does anybody notice something about this picture? Notice anything wrong? Am I the only one? Miss Tammy's not here. She would get it. She's OCD like I am. Look at the left-hand wall. Does that not bother anybody? It's taller. It's asymmetrical. I mean, like, I noticed that when I first went to the place. Like, what are they doing? Why did they build this wall like a foot or half a foot or so higher than the other one? But they did this because that's what a shepherd typically would have done. Do you know why? There's this middle partition that's there. And so one side is higher, one side's a little lower. Sheep don't jump, but goats do. The goats are going to try to get out. So you need a little bit higher wall to try to keep the goats in. And so you know what a shepherd does when he gets his sheep in the fold? He divides the sheep from the goats. Does that sound familiar? Matthew 25, verses 31 through 33. When the Son of Man shall come in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats, and he shall set the sheep on his right hand and the goats on the left. And that's typically how the shepherds did it in those days. The sheep would typically go on the right hand and the goats on the left. I was hoping so bad I could trick somebody into going to the left-hand side so I could have goats. But all the people that were with our group, these were just some people that was with a different group, but they all ended up on the right-hand side, so I guess they're sheep. They're okay. But very interesting when you think about that. That kind of, I told you, Vern likes to say, come off the page. When he mentioned that, and he told us about the wall, and did anybody notice this wall? And I'm going, yeah, I noticed it. It's uneven. He said, there's a reason for that. And then he talks about shepherd. When he comes in, he divides his sheep from his goats. And my mind immediately went to Matthew 25. And then about that time, he started talking about that. And I said, okay, that really does come alive for you when you understand that. But a lot of times, again, you would butt the sheepfold, the semi-permanent or permanent sheepfold, up against a cave for extreme weather. Why do I say for extreme weather? What is there about a cave that would make it useful for extreme weather? Extreme temperatures, I guess I should say. Caves, if you know anything about caves, they stay at a constant temperature, somewhere around, I think it's 65 degrees or so. It can be really, really hot outside, but a cave will be 65 degrees or whatever it is. It can be really, really cold outside, but inside that cave, same temperature. That's the useful thing about caves. So oftentimes they would do that. Here's a little closer view of those two mangers. Here's inside the cave. This is at the Biblical History Center. It wouldn't necessarily look exactly like this. In fact, many times you're dealing with a natural cave. Sometimes they could make a cave, kind of carve a spot into the side of the rock or into the side of the mountain and make that cave. But you see the mangers there. You see a sheep that was as if he were grazing. But I want to turn to Luke chapter 2. What's going on in Luke 2? It's the birth of Jesus. And we typically see this in reenactments and things like that happening where? the front lawn of City Hall, Chris said. We typically see it happening in a stable, right? A barn. And there's nothing in Scripture that says anything about being born in a barn or a stable. Well, people go to that. Why? Because she laid her child in a manger. And over here in the Western world, when we have a manger, and you got horses, donkeys, whatever, you have your manger in your barn. And so we've translated our culture into that biblical text there. Chances are a lot better he was born in a cave, some type of cave where the animals will be, and they could eat. And there's these mangers. So look at Luke chapter 2. It came to pass in those days there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. Why did the Romans start making the Jews, and really anybody under their rule, making them go, but especially the Jews, go to their own city? David is of the tribe of Judah, so he's David. Joseph is of the tribe of Judah, as is Mary. So they're going to their own city, which is Bethlehem, which is in Judea. Why you have to go to your own city? Why can't you pay taxes wherever you're living? They had a tendency to disappear when it was tax collecting time. And so they said, you got to go to your own city, you got to register. There's record there of birth records and things like that, so have them go into their own city. So Joseph went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house and lineage of David, to be taxed with Mary his espoused wife, being great with child. And so it was that while they were there, the days were accomplished that she should be delivered. And she brought forth her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling clothes and laid him in a manger, because there was no room for them in the inn. That in the inn is also unfortunate, because I think if we're not careful there, we once again translate Western culture in, and we think of the Hampton Inn was full. She couldn't get a room, so she just had to settle for the barn. And a lot of times when we portray this, we portray, it's just a terrible situation. People just turned them away. But you know what's going on here? There's a census and tax collection going on. Everybody's got to go back to their city, so it's crowded, right? It's going to be crowded. So it's not going to be it's not going to be the easiest thing to get everybody from your family or whatever. But what's that word, if you know the translation of this word in? It's a better way of putting that. In fact, does anybody have something different in your translation? Luke 2:7? Last word of the verse, yeah. Everybody have in there? A better word would be, a better word would be guest chamber, or in the Greek it's kataluma. And houses, and we'll talk more about this when we get to city life. We'll talk about shepherding life, farmer's life, and then we'll talk about city life. When we get to city life, you'll see the guest chamber. People tended to build on a guest chamber. So if you had family come visit or something like that, you had a place for them to stay. But again, all these families are coming in, and extended family is staying at your house, and there's just no room in the guest chamber. And you can't just keep everybody. And again, sometimes we think, poor, pitiful Mary, poor, pitiful Jesus. But think about this for a second. It's a cave, so you have a constant temperature. Baby Jesus is born, and he's not going to get too hot. He's not going to get too cold. There's privacy out there. They're away from the crowds and all the families. So there's privacy, which is important for Mary while she's in labor. A woman was ceremonially unclean, I believe, 40 days or so after giving birth, depending on male or female. This, of course, didn't affect others in the house because Mary's not in the house. If you're in the house, you might be ceremonially unclean. So she's out there in the cave with the animals, and they don't care if you're clean or unclean. Doesn't affect them. And all that's just to say, sometimes we kind of say, poor Jesus, and I think maybe, or just maybe his birth was more providential than it was pitiable. It certainly was no glorious birth that you would expect of a king, and that's part of the humility of the birth of Christ. But make no mistake, God was looking out for his son from day one. So that's pretty interesting when you stop and think about it. But that's most likely the environment into which Jesus would have been born. It would make, very, very uncommon to have some kind of a wooden barn or stable or something like that, because they had such an overabundance of stone. So they tended to use that. Thinking if there's something else I'm leaving out. I don't have much on this because I don't want to get too far into this. Talking about the life of a shepherd, you have to talk about their tents. Does anybody recognize what this might be? What kind of a tent? This would be actually a combination of goat and camel hair. If I'm not mistaken, if I remember this correctly, the darker fabric is goat's hair. The lighter fabric is camel's hair. There's something interesting about this. Here's a different view of it from the Biblical History Center. This is looking at what will be the side view. These tents are often designed to be very portable. You can see here it would be very, very easy for them to pack this up because it just connects down here with some clasps and such. Same thing up top. It'd be very easy to roll that up, and you can move along pretty quickly. You can use rocks here to weight down. They would often have it facing, if they could, they would get kind of on a leeward side so that they're out of the way of the western winds. If not, you could bring a certain side of the tent down, or you could, if it's really hot weather, you could raise the sides, the front and the back, something like that, let the wind come through. But I think it's my next. Oh, and as I said, here was a different view. By the way, that's looking toward the temporary sheepfold, if you recall the temporary sheepfold. But you can see how the shepherd would kind of make sure those sticks go all around so you can't have an animal just climbing over here. But that's looking toward that temporary sheepfold. But you can see here they've got their things spread around in their tent. We'll talk more about the tent in our next class, some of the intricacies of tent life. But I want to mention this before. I was hoping I wouldn't run out of time, and I think I'm going to be just right on. Here's a magnification of a section of the back flap. The back flap is all goat's hair. And I just totally forgot this last time because we had to skip the big tent at the Biblical History Center this time because there was another group that they were a little bit in front of us, and they were spending a lot more time in the goat's hair tent because they were doing what's called the shepherd's bread. They make this. It's a way that shepherds used to make bread when they were just out in the wilderness. And so sometimes if you arrange a tour around it, you can go down there and you can actually make the shepherd's bread. They do that a lot with kids, homeschool groups, and groups coming in from schools and things like that. They enjoy that. So they were doing that, and we didn't get to go to the tent. And later on, when we went through the Hall of Artifacts, they were done in the tent, and by then I had forgotten. So anyway, if you look up in that tent, you'll see basically this same thing. And what it is it's sunlight coming in. You can see that. And so when you look up, if you're standing in a tent and you look up and you see all these little dots, it's like looking up at night and seeing a cloudless sky. You're out in the middle of nowhere, cloudless sky, and just stars everywhere. That's what it kind of resembles. But if you're standing in a tent and you look up and you see that and you know that's sunlight coming through, what are you thinking? What's your question? What are we supposed to do when it rains? If you got a bunch of little holes in the tent, what do you do when it rains? You know what happens to goat's hair when it rains? It expands. I never knew that. I learned that when I went down there the first time. Goat's hair expands when it rains. And so when it rains, it keeps out the water. And then when it dries up, now it lets air through. And so it doesn't get so stuffy in there. So it's like venting the tent. So pretty interesting stuff. Like I said, we'll talk a lot more about the tent there was I'm in uncharted territory here, y'all. I'm out of material. I'm working ahead. I'm used to running out of time. But there was, by the way, I did want to mention something. You may have noticed the more permanent sheepfold did not have a door. This is what I want to mention. I'm going to run out of time because I forgot this. Turn to John chapter 10. It's too good to be true. Thought I was going to get ahead. John chapter 10. The more permanent sheepfold, you may have noticed, doesn't have a door. And so what would happen is you would have kind of a space, something about, like from here to here, give or take. And your sheep could come in and they could go out. But to protect them, this is where the shepherd would sleep. He would sleep right at the door. And there would be another wall. The rocks would come right here. And he could just sleep there. And he'd have his staff in his hand. And he is protecting the sheep. Anything that comes through has to go through him. Now somebody read John 10, 9 and 10.
I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life, that they may have it more abundantly.
All right, he also says that at the end of verse 7. I'm the door of the sheep. And all that ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep didn't hear it. Jesus says, I'm the door. And when you're in Christ, when you're in his sheepfold, if anybody's going to mess with you spiritually, they got to go through Jesus. And so he says the thief just comes to kill, to steal. He doesn't go through the door. Anybody not coming through the door, he's not coming in for any good purpose. But Jesus says, I'm come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. Gives a little bit more context to that statement when you understand how the shepherd would literally lay himself across the doorway to guard and to protect his sheep. Lord willing, next week we'll pick up here and talk more about the life in the tents that the shepherds often lived. Thank you very much.